Welcome to the Gratitude Radio Show. That isn't a radio show at all, but today we're going to talk about losing the ego, the way of nature, being self-transcendence, and. So, enjoy. Maybe you heard about the sentences, he that loseth his soul shall find it, or while living, be a dead man, for roughly dead. Then, whatever you do, just as you will be right, or you can find me when I'm lost. But what does it really mean? It is a real communication, a description of something which happens to people, like the rain or the touch of the wind. It is simply the expression of the universal discovery that a man does not really begin to be alive until he has lost himself. But what does it mean to lose yourself? Well, a man does not really begin to be alive until he has released the anxious grasp which he normally holds upon his life, his property, his reputation, his position, his ego, aka persona, aka mask. As soon as you detach yourself from anything you really hold on to, you find yourself in complete emptiness. The holy poverty, a situation where you find yourself that you have nothing to lose in the sense of having nothing but possessing all things. Okay, I get it that I should detach myself from my property or position because it's obviously absurd to define yourself through materialistic things. But why the fuck should I detach myself from my own ego? Well, the most important object in the sense of possession is the self, including our body, name, social status, knowledge, habits, image that we have of ourselves and that we want to convey to others. The essential thing is not the content from which our own ego exists, but rather the fact that we perceive our ego as a thing that we own, and that this thing is the basis of our experience of identity. Okay, still, why the fuck should I detach myself from my ego? Okay, to answer that in an understandable way, I refer to Lao Tzu. The essence of Lao Tzu's philosophies is the difficult art of getting out of one's own way. In the Chinese language, nature has no English equivalent. It literally means self-so. To the wise Chinese, nature is what works and moves by itself without having to be shoved about, wound up, or controlled by conscious effort. And if you simply look at nature, it really just is. It's self-so. And if we take a look at nature, we should not just consider some trees, clouds, birds, the wind, etc. as parts of nature, but also ourselves. We are as much a part of nature as a river is. So, nature is basically self-so. So is the human being. Our hearts beat self-so. Our bones grow self-so. Our physical wounds heal self-so. And if we would give it half a chance, our minds can function self-so. But what does it really mean to be self-so? Well, the way of nature, the way of happening self-so, or if you like, the very process of life, is something Lao Tzu was much too wise to define. Trying to say anything definite about it is like trying to eat your own mouth. The way of nature cannot be defined. That's basic. Just because it is the flow of nature, you can't capture it. You can't shut up wind in a box and expect it to be wind. You can't catch flowing water in a bucket because the minute it's in a bucket, it's no longer flowing. The way of nature that can be mentioned is not the real way of nature. It remains an unsolved mystery. The rational mind will be unsatisfied as fuck, no, but you simply cannot define, imagine, understand, or desire it. It's too close to be seen and too obvious to be noticed or understood. The way of nature is more us than we are ourselves. Perhaps it's the you that grows your nervous system, rather than the you that uses the nerves to decide, think, and act. So, there is something that makes the whole world go around, including ourselves, but somehow we have the feeling that we're just partly, let's say, led or controlled by it, since we have our own will, that gives us the notion of dictating our own lives. In that case, our ego or self-consciousness suggests the division of our being from the rest of the world. To the degree that we feel this division, we're always trying to control and understand and dominate our subconscious self with our conscious and willful self. And to do so is like falling over one's own feet, and therefore perpetually getting in one's own way. Schopenhauer's words would be adequate as fuck at this point. Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. Albert Einstein got influenced by that saying from an early age, and therefore wrote in his book, The World as I See It, in human freedom, in the philosophical sense, I'm definitely a disbeliever. Everybody acts not only under external compulsion, but also in accordance with inner necessity. Schopenhauer's saying has been an inspiration to me since my youth up, and a continual consolation and unfailing wellspring of patience in the face of the hardships of life, my own and others. This feeling mercifully mitigates the sense of responsibility which so easily becomes paralyzing, and it prevents us from taking ourselves and other people too seriously. It conduces to a view of life in which humor, above all, has its due place. These two fellows were commenting on the illusory nature of free will. As human beings are capable of rational thought and self-reflection, we imagine ourselves to have a free will, which makes us distinct from inanimate objects and animals. We believe we are masters of our own destinies because we can choose to conform our actions to our desires. We can do what we want. However, if our choices are determined by our desires, then the freedom of our choices really depends on whether our desires are free in the first place, doesn't it? If we follow the origin of our desires to its base level, we inevitably end up at a source of action that is external to our conscious self. Man is not truly free because he is slave to desires he has no control over. He cannot will what he wills, and thus is no more special or different from any other object in the universe. Our mind believes that it can and should control the environment in order to survive, which is kind of egocentric because the vast majority of processes within as well as outside ourselves are not in our control. I mean, let's face it, we don't control our bodily processes. We don't control other people. We don't control the future. We don't even control who we fall in love with and what people we find attractive. These observations jive well with those who have suggested that there is no independent originating entity within a human being that makes decisions. I can almost hear the clamor of objections as I say this, so let's take a moment. At the first sight, we think that we're in total control of what we're doing, but if you really think through to the end, you will realize that the actual motive of doing anything is not under your control. Just examine some significant events in your life. Those are all get-togethers of favorable conditions that lead to success in each case. Check the complacency and arrogance that has grown out of seeing yourself as the main reason for success. If you look at the whole matter, at life in general, in the light of interdependence, you will understand that success is not yours, but a consequence of the meeting of different conditions that were beyond your reach. Self-transcendence is, at its core, about transcending or rising above the self and relating to that which is greater than the self. In simpler terms, it is the realization that you are one small part of a greater whole and acting accordingly. By hearing this, a lot of people might feel hurt because they take themselves too seriously. It is well that one who is too much concerned with his own affairs should consider the immensity of the way of life. But let him not consider it too long, lest he forget that the responsibility not only for human prosperity, but also for the order of the universe is his own. Man is in himself a little universe. The ordering of his mind and body is complex as the ordering of the stars. Can we say then that the governing of a man's universe is less important because it is different in size? Anyways, once we spontaneously realize that we're actually not in control, we're giving away the control. And by doing so, we've got it. What? I know. This sounds paradoxical as fuck, but it is like it is. For real. To quote Schopenhauer once again, throughout the centuries, the poor truth has blushed that it was paradoxical, and yet it is not her fault. It cannot assume the form of enthroned general error. With a sigh, she looks up to its patron god, the time, which beckons victory and glory to her. but whose wings are so big and slow that the individual dies over it. So I am also very well aware of the paradox that this metaphysical interpretation of the archetypal phenomenon must have for the occidentally educated who are used to completely different justifications of ethics. But I cannot do violence to the truth. I don't want to convince you that it is like that. You can skip this episode, but if you're interested and open for new perspectives, feel free to listen further. So, if we're not really in control of ourselves, we're functioning, or better said, living self-so, right? Correct. Well, almost. The paradoxical thing is that we're self-so all the time, but as long as our mind tries to be self-so, it's hindering us being truly self-so, although we're actually self-so. Fuck my life. In this sense, our ego is the mind that struggles for its own survival by being a constant source of disturbance. It makes your daily life more difficult than it needs to be and creates unnecessary suffering. And to solve the problem of the ego, our ego tries to provide solutions. And before highlighting these apparent solutions, let's focus on the essential characteristic of being self-so. To truly be self-so, or in harmony with the way of nature, I gotta refer to the Chinese term wu wei, that literally means non-doing, non-striving, effortless action, not seeking for a result. A river doesn't flow in order to do something else. It just flows. A tree doesn't grow in order to achieve something. It simply grows. It simply is. It just does. There is no specific method regarding how the act of doing is getting done. It's just getting done. By the way, that's why I love Nike's trademark, just do it so much, but whatever. But people often do things in order to achieve something. People try to actualize or transcend themselves in order to be different. They force themselves in order to have more self-respect in their own eyes or to attain some spiritual experience, some exaltation of consciousness, the desire for which is the very form of their self-interest. Nothing wrong with having goals, because goals initiate actions, but as soon as one gets absorbed by trying to reach the goal, the danger arises of forgetting the simple act of doing or enjoying the process. And suddenly, you're on your deathbed, and you cannot believe that you actually regret so many things just because of focusing too much on an absorbingly important future, instead of simply living in the present, being self-so. As always, we gotta keep the balance. Of course, we should not get rid of our goals or some basic results that we can expect, since we do not come to the table without expecting dinner or get on a bus to go nowhere special. I'm talking of results in the human and spiritual sphere. Such things as goodness, peace of mind, sanity, happiness, courage, and of course, being self-so. Although being self-so is the only way to simply be self-so, our ego somehow still declares being self-so or transcending oneself a goal or a state we should attain by a method, in the sense of wu wei, by non-striving, effortless action. But this just leads to misunderstandings that our ego provides us mistaken solutions, deliberate imitation, and deliberate relaxation. The former refers to knowing what the sane and natural way of living is, and therefore to embody it in laws and principles, techniques and ideas, and then try by a deliberate effort of imitation to follow them. The latter focuses more on to hell with it all, to attempt to relax one's mind, that just leads to a vast, sloppy, disorganized mess, or to a kind of compulsive stillness or equally compulsive psychological diarrhea. Both approaches had a result in mind. This should not be a sermon, because being self-so is not really a percept that could simply be practiced or obeyed. And this fact makes the talk about necessity of selflessness or transcending the ego so fantastically misunderstood. The notion that you can attain this state by some effort or by some special capacity of his own is always absurd and impossible. The funny thing is that since we are actually self-so all the time, our ego still can't get rid of the idea of trying to reach that state. Being self-so is omnipresent and ubiquitous, and still, we don't know actually what it is. We cannot possibly define the state of being in harmony with the way of nature. We have simply no idea what the goal ought to be. Well then, is it possible for me to stop seeking for these results? Surely, the very question implies that I have still a result in mind, even if this is the state of not seeking results. It seems, therefore, that I'm helpless, that I'm simply unable to think or act without some result in mind. It makes no difference whether I do or don't do. I'm still compulsively, helplessly seeking a result. So I find myself in a trap. I must purpose. I might almost say I am purpose. Thinking that through to the end, we have found out what our ego actually is, a result seeking mechanism. Such a mechanism is rather useful gadget when the results in question are things like food or shelter for the organism. But when the results which the mechanism seeks are not external objects but states of itself, such as happiness, the mechanism is all clutched up. It is trying to lift itself by its own bootstraps. Thus, the ego serves us in a sense of surviving and maintaining our existence. But keep in mind that there is a difference between barely existing and truly living. Truly living is self-so, but barely existing too. The difference is that the one who truly lives is aware of his life. He's kind of awake, realizing the remarkable miracle that life actually is and losing the sense of time. And the one who barely exists is kind of asleep. He lives, but in a way that he considers life being too short, not embracing sobriety and therefore thinking more about what he should have than about what he actually has. I guess you understand. Still, since it serves our existence, of course, dissolving or losing the ego isn't literally getting rid of the ego, but placing it in a healthier position. It gets integrated. Lao Tse said, "The universe is everlasting." The reason that the universe is everlasting is that it does not live for itself. Therefore, it lasts. Therefore, the sage puts himself behind and finds himself in front, regards his person as outside himself, and his person is preserved. Is it not because he does not live for himself that he realizes himself? By losing your ego, you do yourself a favor, but remember, all of this happens way or no how. It just happens, completely spontaneous. There is no way, no method, no technique which you or I can use to come into accord with the way of nature, because every how, every method implies a goal. And we cannot make being self-so a goal any more than we can aim an arrow at itself. If we once get into the tangled state of the arrow which is trying to shoot itself, the self trying to change itself, we can't do anything to stop it. So long as we think or feel that perhaps we can stop it, that there is some way, violent or subtle, difficult or easy, to make ourselves unselfish, the contradiction will continue or get worse. We gotta see that there is no way. But in a state where we have realized that there is no way to be found, no result to be gained, the vicious circle breaks. Ouroboros, the snake eating his tail, has become conscious all the way round and knows at last that that tail is the other end of his head. We find ourselves in these circles because of ignorance, because of unconsciousness, of the nature of our minds, of our thought processes, of ourselves. Before we start philosophizing more and more, I guess at this point it's good to refresh ourselves and ask what the ego is. It's the sense of self that separates us from the rest of the world, although we're an integral, inseparable part of the world. Our conscious mind, the mind's identity of our own construction, an identity which is false because it has been heavily conditioned by the society we grew up in. We're more than just a mind, but we only realize that when we leave our mind behind and embrace intuition. But just saying. Carl Jung coined the term psychic death, which is a synonym for ego death. He came to the realization that in order to radically improve global quality of life, it seems necessary to have a fundamental transformation of the psyche, a shift in personality, a shift back to the existential position of the natural self that enables living the true purpose of life, just living self-so, what also became an essential part of the hierarchy of human needs. That ego death can be linked with peeling an onion, where the layers represent artificial parts of ourselves that got created by the ego, which are waiting to get unmasked so that we can truly be self-so. In Zen Buddhism, the task of self-transcendence is likened to a mosquito trying to bite an iron ball. The transforming death comes about at the very moment when the iron hide of the bull finally and absolutely rejects the mosquito's frail proboscis. So, the main point is that the state metaphorically called ego death or self-transcendence is not a future condition to be acquired, it is rather a present fact. This willful, compulsive, moralistic approach to man's transformation always obstructs it, for it still implies that very illusion of self-mastery which stands in the way. Remember Schopenhauer's free will. But it is just when I discover that I cannot surrender myself that I'm surrendered. For in reaching this hard rock of the impossible, one reaches sincerity, where there can no longer be the masked hide and seek of I and me, good I trying to change bad me, who is really the same fellow as good I. In the expressive imagery of Zen, all this striving for self-transcendence is like trying to put legs on a snake, or shall I say, like a naked man trying to lose his shirt. As already mentioned, the way of nature cannot be defined. That's basic, just because it is the flow of nature. You can't capture it. You can't shut up wind in a box and expect it to be wind. You can't catch flowing water in a bucket because the minute it's in a bucket, it's no longer flowing. So the way of nature that can be mentioned is not the real way of nature. It remains an unsolved mystery. We cannot possibly define self-transcendence or that state of being in harmony with the way of nature. We have simply no idea what the goal ought to be. The rational mind would still be unsatisfied as fuck now. This reminds me of my former math teacher at university, the one and only Christoph Leubner, who said that one cannot know anything. Actually, the same that Socrates meant with, I know that I know nothing. Additionally, let's drop some wise Erich Fromm stuff. Knowledge begins with the recognition of the deceptions through the perceptions of our so-called common sense. Not just in the sense that our image of physical reality does not correspond to actual reality, but in particular in the sense that most people are half awake and half dreaming, and are not aware that most of what they take to be true and self-evident are illusions caused by the suggestive influence of the social environment in which they live. Knowledge does not mean to be in possession of truth, but rather to penetrate the surface to the roots and thus to the causes to see reality in its nakedness. Since being self-so means nothing more than being real or living in harmony with truth, still, this truth or reality cannot be known. It can only be known intuitively by getting rid of unreality, of contradictory and absurd ways of thinking and feeling. Shout out to the onion. Anyways, this reality, way of nature, self-so is more us than we are ourselves, and a distinct and definite knowledge is possible in respect of everything capable of becoming an object of knowledge. But it is not possible in the case of that which cannot become such an object. That is reality, for it is the knower, and the knower can know other things, but cannot make itself the object of its own knowledge. In the same way that fire can burn other things, but cannot burn itself. It is like an eye that sees, but cannot see itself. Shout out to Viktor Frankl for that metaphor. A similar difficulty exists for physics in any attempt to investigate the nature of energy, for there is a point at which physics, as much as metaphysics, enters the realm of tautology and absurdity because of the circular character of the task which it attempts to study electrons with instruments which are after all electrons themselves. We have perhaps forgotten that there was a time when we wanted to be told what an electron is. The question was never answered. The point which emerges is that what we are counting or measuring in physics, and that what we are experiencing in every life as sense data, is at root unknown and probably unknowable. Only a rather dry kind of mind turns away from that, a mind interested in nothing but logical structures. The more complete kind of mind, which can feel as well as think, remains to indulge the odd sense of mystery which comes from contemplating the fact that everything is at base something which cannot be known. Every statement which you make about this something turns out to be nonsense, and what is especially strange is that this unknowable something is also the basis of that which otherwise I know so intimately, myself. The resistance in terms of acknowledging the unknown is rather the fundamental unwillingness of this type of mind to contemplate the limits of its power to succeed, order, and control. It feels that if there are areas of life which it cannot order, it is surely reasonable to forget them and turn to areas of life which can be ordered, so that the sense of success of the mind's own competence can be maintained. The contemplation of these intellectual limitations is, for the pure intellectual, a humiliation. But for the man who is something more than a calculator, the baffling is also the wonderful. In the face of the unknowable, he feels with Goethe that the highest to which man can attain is wonder, and if the prime phenomenon makes him wonder, let him be content. Nothing higher can it give him, and nothing further should he seek for behind it. Here is the limit. We identify I with the conscious will, and do not admit moral authority or responsibility for what we do unconsciously and unintentionally, the implication being that such acts are not our deeds but merely events which happen within us. When I is identified with consciousness, man feels himself to be a detached, separate, and uprooted entity acting freely in a void. The ego feels uprooted so long as it avoids and refuses to accept the fact that it does not and cannot know its own base or ground. But when this is recognized, the consciousness feels connected, rooted, even though it does not know to what it is connected, in what it is rooted, so long as it retains delusions of self-sufficiency, omnicompetence, and individual free will. It ignores the unknown on which it rests. So, as long as one ignores the unknown ground on which one rests, one is kind of disconnected. And when one is disconnected, one feels insecure, frustrated, therefore tries to control, to play God. And so, the unknown is home. The unknown is mystery. Unknown is paradise, if you want so. Known is ego. I know where I'm going. I know I'm doing really good. Who knows that? This is about unknowing. It's about undressing the self, taking off all those masks and costumes and belief systems that we have been spoon-fed. How little do we investigate these beliefs we've been spoon-fed? Well, I heard someone say that we're here to do this and this and this and this and this and this, and I just feel awful. Because you don't have to do it. That's why you feel awful, because you're not meant to bully yourself and try to correct things and fix things that aren't broken. Nothing is broken. It's just the belief system. The man who tries to know, to grasp himself, becomes insecure, just as one suffocates by holding one's own breath. Conversely, the man who really knows that he cannot grasp himself gives up, relaxes, and is at ease. But he never really knows if he simply dismisses the problem and does not pause to wonder, to feel, and to become vividly aware of the real impossibility of self-knowledge. What arises from that is love, but someone not in the sense of an emotion, but a general state of mind which exists when a man, through the realization of its impossibility, is no longer trying to grasp himself, to order everything and be dictator of the universe. By love, it may be gotten and holden, but by thought, never. The way of nature must be known through unknowing. Furthermore, what also arises is faith, what is not the same as belief, since belief has a determinate nature. It's the recognition that one must ultimately give in to a life source, a self beyond the ego, which lies beyond the definition of thought and the control of action. A good friend of mine, Taylor, shout out to you, brother, told me once that the way of nature is unknown to those who know it, and is known to those who do not know it at all. This knowledge of reality by unknowing is the psychological state of the man whose ego is no longer split or dissociated from its experiences, who no longer feels himself as an isolated embodiment of logic and consciousness, separate of the unknown. He is thus delivered from the squirrel cage psychology of all those human beings who everlastingly frustrate themselves with impossible task of knowing the knower, controlling the controller, and organizing the organizer, like Ouroboros, the mixed-up snake who dines off his own tail. Buddha found something which cannot be expressed in any form of words, an experience which every man must undergo for himself, which can no more be passed on from one man to another than you can eat another person's food for him. Egotism is a fierce holding on to oneself. It is building oneself up in a haughty stronghold, refusing to join in the play of life, refusing to accept the eternal laws of change, of movement to which all are subject. But that refusal can only be illusion. Whether we like it or not, change comes, and the greater the resistance, the greater the pain. To quote my man Bruce Lee, to change with change is the changeless state. I also remember when June, a lovely friend of mine, shout out to you, and enthusiastically stated, "Nothing defines me because definition excludes the possibility to change." Buddhism, for example, perceives the beauty of change, for life is like music in this. If any note or phrase is held for longer than its appointed time, the melody is lost. Therefore, self-consciousness is a stoppage, because it is like interrupting a song after every note so as to listen to the echo, and then feeling irritated because of the loss of rhythm. Thus, Buddhism and self-transcendence may be summed up in two phrases: let go and walk on. Drop and detach yourself from the craving for self, for permanence, for particular circumstances, and go straight ahead with the movement of life. When we're not able to do so, we find ourselves in these vicious circles because of ignorance, because of unconsciousness of the nature of our minds, of our thought processes, of ourselves. At this point, I really feel like referring to Tim Urban, a remarkable author who named the unconsciousness of the nature of our minds the fog, something that prevents us from seeing the big picture, something that serves our low-grade qualities such as fear, pettiness, jealousy, greed, instant gratification, etc., something that can be described as a source of unhappiness. He considers our whole life as an awareness game. The more you're aware, the more you're thinning the fog, and therefore you start unknowing. For example, imagine yourself going for some groceries to the supermarket and suddenly the cashier is really rude to you. If your ego is ruling you, you snap back at the rude cashier who had the nerve to be an asshole to you. If you're more aware, you start thinning the fog by revealing the context so that you come to the conclusion that the rudeness doesn't faze you because you know it's about him, not you, and that you have no idea what his day or life has been like. When you're able to see even a bigger picture, you do not only take it personally at all, but also you see yourself as a miraculous arrangement of atoms in vast space that for a split second an endless eternity has come together to form a moment of consciousness that is your life. And you see that cashier as another moment of consciousness that happens to exist on the same speck of time and space that you do. And the only possible emotions you could have for him is love. And since you still don't know your own ground, you're like a molecule floating around an ocean you don't understand. So whatever comes your way, you enjoy, faithfully trusting that you're just going with the flow. In the end, it's not about knowledge, it's about wisdom. Wisdom gives people the insight to know what fulfilled and meaningful actually means, and the courage to make the choice that will get them there. And while life experience can contribute to wisdom, wisdom is mostly already all in our heads. When we're not wise, it's because we're standing in our own way. We don't have access to the wisdom because it's buried in the fog. The fog is kind of anti-wisdom. And when you realize that, wisdom is simply a byproduct of increased awareness. In relation to the way of nature, there is neither inside or outside. Sometimes it is called non-duality because nothing else exists beside it and nothing is excluded from it. It is to be found on the surface as much as in the depths. Thus, it can neither be lost nor found, and you cannot avail yourself of its powers any more than you can dispense with them. For all these conceptions of having and not having, of gain and loss, finite and infinite, belong to the principle of duality. Every dualism is exclusive. Awareness is never exclusive, just saying. But when you see that all such attempts are fruitless, and when you relax the fear-born resistance to life in yourself and around you, which is called egoism, you realize the freedom of union with the way of nature. In fact, you have always had this freedom, for the state of union with nature can neither be attained nor lost. All men and all things have it, in spite of themselves. It can only be realized, which is to say, made real to you, by letting life live you for a while instead of trying to make yourself live life. That's what Zen teachers are demonstrating. Life, just as it is, and that man, just as he is Buddha. Zen does not say so as a rule, because the term Buddha is a concept which does not move the soul deeply and lead easily to mere intellectualism. Zen wants us to feel non-duality, not just to think. Zen aims to affect a psychological or spiritual state that moves the whole being, not the head alone. Some call it energy, others call it the way of nature. I like to call it vibe. As soon as you feel the vibe of life, your perception of life starts to shift and loses its conditioned filters. A shift in focus from the self to the others takes place. Furthermore, our values shift too, because you no longer find yourself driven by extrinsic motivation or external rewards and demands, but by intrinsic motivation, so that the reward for an activity is the activity itself. It's an awe-like wow moment that makes you feel ridiculously profoundly humble. Something that you can notice at really successful sportsmen or entrepreneurs, that once you got it, are the ones who don't ascribe their fame, success, wealth, health, achievements, etc. to themselves, but to something else, because they look at life in the light of interdependence. They realize that the true reason for the situation was a get-together of favorable conditions, a consequence of the meeting of different conditions that were beyond their reach. So a goosebump-like feeling arises, and suddenly you feel genuine gratitude. You get high of life somehow. You feel blessed. From the philosophic standpoint, there is no real ground for gratitude, because in non-duality, there is neither giver nor receiver. But from the emotional standpoint, there appears to be every reason for gratitude. The experience of self-transcendence or freedom is like discovering an immeasurably precious jewel in one's littlest acts and lowest thoughts. One discovers it where all jewels are first found, in the depths of the earth or lying in the mud. Those who appreciate jewels do not leave them there. They lift them up from the depths, polish them, place them on velvet, or set them in gold. No worries, you're not gonna become Gollum. This polishing and adornment is our symbol of morality, the expression of our joy and gratitude in realizing this very earth is a blessing, a miracle, and this very body is the body of Buddha, if you want so. Therefore, service, morality, and gratitude are our response as human beings for a gift which we cannot define. If you read between the lines, you will recognize self-transcendence. You say, you do not feel this abandonment or bliss right now. What do you expect to feel? It is not a feeling. It is feeling. It is not a thought. It is thinking. If it were a particular thought or feeling, there could be coming into it and going out of it. But the way of nature is one and all-inclusive, and here there can be neither coming nor going, inside or outside. More than this, it does not depend even on feeling and thinking, consciousness or unconsciousness, living or dying. As the word says, this you cannot describe, nor paint, nor yet admire, nor feel. No, you can't feel it. But how can you know anything about it at all? Because you can use it and feel its use, just as the wind bloweth where it listeth, and thou hearest the sound thereof, but canst not tell whence it cometh, nor whither it goeth. What is it like to feel its use? Sudden, the cold air swing, alone aloud. A whirrs of bells takes wing, and flies with the cloud. It's just there. A fun fact regarding the whole talk about being self-so, the way of nature, etc., is that to a human being that knows nothing of the way of nature, mountains are mountains, waters are waters, and trees are trees. When he has read something and understood a little of the various scriptures regarding the whole phenomenon, mountains are to him no longer mountains, waters no longer waters, and trees no longer trees. But when he just got it, when he completely realized the way of nature, then mountains are once again mountains, waters waters, and trees trees. Often, philosophy is itself the disease for which it pretends to be the cure, and that's what Zen teachers are doing right. Zen has no symbolic meaning, and it is about nothing, but It is something, and that something is that very obvious but much more ignored thing: life. The Zen master is in fact demonstrating life in its actuality. Without words or ideas, he is teaching his disciples to know life directly. Sometimes in answer to a religious question, he will give a smack on the face, returning reality for an abstraction. If he gave a reasoned answer, the disciple would be able to analyze it, to subject it to the intellectual dissection, and to imagine a mere lifeless formula as a living truth. But with a smack or with a bird, there can be no mistake. A smack is here, one moment and gone the next. There is nothing you can catch hold of, nothing other than the most lively fact, as much alive as the passing moment which can never be made to stay. And a bird is a bird. You hear its song, but you cannot seize the notes to make them continue. It just is, and is gone, and you feel the beauty of its song precisely because the notes do not wait for you to analyze them. Therefore, the Zen master is not trying to give you ideas about life. He's trying to give you life itself, to make you realize life in and around you, to make you live it instead of being a mere spectator, a mere pedant absorbed in the dry bones of something which the life has long deserted. A symphony is not explained by a mathematical analysis of its notes. The mystery of a woman's beauty is not revealed by a post-mortem dissection, and no one ever understood the wonder of a bird by stuffing it and putting it in a glass case. To understand these things, you must live and move with them as they are alive. And the very best about all of this is that everybody, actually everything, is your potential Zen master, always. That is to say, one must understand that not only oneself, but all other things in the universe are meaningless and dead when considered by themselves as permanent, isolated, and self-sufficient entities. Unless related to the whole, the part is without value. And it is just this relating of the part to the whole, or rather this realization of an already existing relationship, which is the union with the way of nature. The way of nature that brings together everything and shapes after its own meaning. As to meaning itself, it cannot be described. It can only be experienced, and only experienced when there is such love between oneself and the world that what each makes together is more than either, just as to husband and wife, the child is more than themselves. P.S. So then, what is self-transcendence? An old blind man was walking through his village with a lantern in his hand in the middle of the night. He got spotted by another man who asked him what the fuck he was doing. The old blind man responded, "I know this street millimeter by millimeter. I've walked it almost every day for the past 100 years, but I was told it was a pitch black night, and those who do not know the village well may have to see to avoid stumbling. I have the lantern with me to make their way a little easier and safer, not to shine for myself. Self-transcendence, the way of nature, is a path that you walk alone without being lonely." Peace.